I killed my mother. You heard me. But I didn't do it alone. My brother and sister helped. My mother used to say to us throughout our childhood under her breath, "You all are killing me." I think maybe she was on to something. But by the time we got around to actually doing it, it would have been more like a plea. When we finally killed her, her last breath was a sigh of relief. My mother had Alzheimer's, and her decline was slow and lasted over a decade. She was a quirky woman to begin with, so it was difficult to know what was mom, what was Alzheimer's, and what was just a little bit too much Chardonnay. Growing up, Thanksgiving dinners at my aunt's house were like a corporate event. My mom with her clipboard, barking orders, and consulting her checklist constantly. She was afraid of forgetting. She kept track of everything. Many people keep a desk calendar. Hers was a detailed play-by-play of the day's events, including commentary. She was incredibly charming, but she had her share of awkward moments. At one of my parents' parties, the night had hit its peak, but my mother was tired and was ready for it to be over. She clapped her hands and announced coat time and had everyone out the door within minutes. This is just one example of how she lived her life on her own terms. But as time went on, there was less charm and more awkwardness. She was always blunt and straightforward, but slowly her quirks began to border on hurtful. Once she called me on my birthday and said, "Oh, do you remember that day? Do you remember? I was crying. I do not want this baby. I do not want this baby." And she told me the story in jest. It was difficult to hear, and I knew it was not true. I am sure she was overwhelmed to have a third child. But in her healthiest days, she would never even hint that there was a second when I wasn't wanted. The fact that she was sharing that with me now told me she was no longer herself. We all talk about wanting a long life, but my mom's life should have ended long before it did. And 5 years into her illness, she had forgotten how to swallow and had to be force-fed. She still had her spunk and still had moments when she could connect with her family and grandchildren. She wasn't completely gone. There was still life in her. So her doctor, with my father's support, decided to put in a feeding tube. There was no family conference or discussion. I learned of the news over the phone. And even saying this is difficult. It brings up the most controversial issues and debates. I had argued with friends about Terry Schiavo in the abstract. And then suddenly the morality of a feeding tube became more personal than I had ever imagined it would be. But I wanted to and needed to support my father. And I guess I didn't know how to let my mother go. But was the decision to keep her alive in this way killing her? She had been a fashion model and took pride in her appearance and health. She was not one for a huge plate of pasta or a multi-course dinner. She would rather than sit down to a meal, she would rather graze like a little bird and had a lifelong habit of keeping a plate of various little tidbits in the kitchen. She would sample it throughout the day, savoring the pleasure and enjoying the restraint. Having someone stuff a spoonful of food down her throat would have been a nightmare. So would someone injecting high-caloric liquid through a tube into her stomach. One morning, soon after the feeding tube was put into my mother in New York, I was in my kitchen in Colorado with my then 3.5-year-old daughter. Our breakfast ritual entailed me running around throwing eggs on the table while I stuffed my mouth with toast or whatever was around. And I was feeling so sad and heavy-hearted that I sat down for a minute. My daughter moved the glass and the plate that were on the counter. At first, I thought she was taking the food from me. I was used to the stage where things were hers, not mine. But then I realized that she was sweetly making sure that a plate of food and juice were in front of me, and that I had the utensils and a napkin. I looked at her and said, "Best kid in the world." I shared this moment and the torture over my mother's feeding tube to my theater company later that night. I didn't see the connection, but in their playback of my check-in, they asked, "How do we feed our mothers?" And they ended with saying to me, "Best kid in the world." I cried. I did not feel like the best kid in the world. I felt like I was prolonging my mother's life when it was no longer hers. As my mother grew more and more sick, Alzheimer's set in further and left her lying in a bed, motionless, unable to speak. We spent 3 years trying to encourage our father to let our mother go. We told him, "It is time. The feeding tube has served its purpose, and now that purpose is done." My siblings and I talked about how outraged Mom would be if she knew what was going on, but my father said he could not be responsible for her death. At this point, I could hear my mother yelling in frustration, "Why aren't you kids killing me?" My siblings and I plotted over, making the decision without consent. Hospice discouraged this. They said we had to think about the surviving parent. In principle, it might not be the right thing to do, but in practice, the emotional impact would be far worse. On November 4th, 2013, my dad lost his battle with cancer. 1 week later, on November 11th at 2 p.m., we removed my mother's feeding tube. My sister and I watched the doctor's procedure. My mother's body rigid, her arm curled up against her in protection like a bird's wing. The tube was also curled, and I was struck by how much it resembled an umbilical cord. The doctor pulled it from her belly and cut it. The belly that had held and fed and given life to my sister, my brother, and me. There would be no more source of food or water. The decision final. I walked into the hallway after that, and there stood my husband holding a pizza. And he said, "Rebecca, you should eat." But after that, I said, "How can I?" Next came waiting. I didn't think it would be important for me to be with my mom when she finally let go. I had been experiencing letting her go for years. So I came back to Colorado with my family, and 2 nights later, I had a dream. I was in the living room of my parents' house, standing by my mother's sides, the silhouettes of my brother and sister in the doorway. My mother rolled over, reached for me, and said, "I am so glad you are here." I hadn't heard her voice in over a year. I woke up and was on a plane to New York 5 hours later. Maybe she called me to her. Maybe I just needed to be with her. My sister, brother, and I moved into the house we grew up in. We waited and waited, taking turns at her side. Our mother lived until the last possible minute a person can survive without food or water. Her final days, her breaths became rapid and labored. On November 23rd, it was my turn at her side. her quick gasps, a constant sound in the house. I woke at 3 in the morning to her panting. I went upstairs to go to the bathroom. It had been 13 days, and I was beginning to feel like, okay, maybe my mother will never let go. As I came down the stairs, though, something was different. And that's when I heard it. The sigh of relief. I turned on the light. Her eyes were wide open, looking into the distance, and there was a slight smile on her face. I don't know what to say about the feeding tube, the putting it in and the removing it. I know that both decisions were made with the best intentions and with the utmost love. Both killed her in different ways. I miss my mom. And there are no words to fully capture how awful and confusing the final stage of her life was. For her, for us, for now. I go on making hot cereal, egg sandwiches, French toast for my 9-year-old daughter every morning, and I don't rush through it. It is the best part of my day. Thank you so much.